My name's Andy Doan, and I run the systems team at Linaro. Ben works with me also, and we've got another guy named Paul, and we're in charge of a bunch of different services that Linaro runs, like the Git servers, Bugzilla, our CI servers, and we're also in charge of what we call our publishing servers. And the presentation was kind of is a two-part thing. We recently hit a big bug on releases.linaro.org that we finally worked around. And in the course of that, we found ourselves running one of our most heavily used sites at Linaro on ARM hardware. So the other part of this was I was kind of hoping to get some people to kind of have a more collaborative talk about different services Linaro might be able to move to run on real ARM hardware. So just a little bit on what releases is. We call that one of our publishing servers. The two others being snapshots.linaro.org and builds.96boards.org, which are basically it's a Django web app. They share the same code, and it serves releases. It serves build artifacts that we have. Some are public, some require EULAs to accept, and some are private depending on who you're logged in as to what you'll see. And every artifact Linaro has ever created lives on releases. So over time, our storage requirements have grown pretty enormous, and this was running in Amazon, and the data volume bills were growing pretty high. So I guess about a year ago, we switched to using Amazon's S3 to store our artifacts. And S3 is Amazon's object storage system, and for our needs, it was basically faster, cheaper, more reliable. It was pretty much better in every way. And it's backed by a REST API to find out like what artifacts you have. And it turned out that API is close enough to kind of look like, it kind of has semantics that make it feel a little bit like dealing with a normal file system, so we could kind of fit it into our publishing server code without too much pain. And at the time, I made a kind of a big technical decision that I did a lot of testing, and I figured out that per user request, we could just talk to the S3 API, and it was basically a negligible performance impact on our end users. So it essentially saved me a little time. I didn't have to worry about caching logic. And we were a little bit nervous with caching logic because we have like these private files and stuff, and if we accidentally serve the wrong file to the wrong person, it could be a pain. So this is kind of the timeline of events. It's a 10-month window of page load response times on our front page of our service. And you can see when we deployed S3 pretty much a little over a year ago, we had a small bump in page load times, and that was what I had expected, and essentially no one noticed. It was pretty negligible. And then time goes on about 6 months, and you see just on a specific day, everything went to crap. And full disclosure, we weren't monitoring page load times on this service. We were monitoring more like, is it offline or online kind of stuff. And around the same time, all of a sudden, Riku was probably one of the first people, and the CI team started seeing a lot of just completely sporadic SSL kind of handshake failures when they were trying to download files. So we kind of had all this stuff going on. Then you can see it in the far right, like it got really bad with page load times, and we kind of were trying to figure out what was going on. I kind of had this, I've always kind of had this fear in my mind, I'm going to get assigned a bug and not be able to fix it, and I'm just going to get fired because I can't solve the bug. And this was starting to feel like that at the time, because it seemed like two issues. It seemed like there was something wrong with SSL, and it also seemed like S3 had just gotten slow, but we felt like it had to be our fault. It couldn't just be SSL's too quality of a thing and Apache and S3, like how could they be at fault? So we needed a way to debug things, and we needed something with a really reliable internet connection, and we needed it pretty fast. And I happen to run the Colo in Austin, and I have access to lots of ARM servers. And I guess the one kind of silver lining for Ben and I in this moment, when things can't get any worse, you have a lot of freedom to experiment. So we finally just said, you know what, let's just get one of these bare metal servers in the lab. We'll throw, on the host OS, we put Ubuntu Xenial. And then we actually ran releases within a LXC container that was on Trusty, which is what we had our publishing servers on at the time. So it would kind of keep us on the same OS and help us start to debug, like it's not on Amazon's network. We try to figure out what's going on. And another kind of side note to the way our releases server was working at this point, we had Amazon has kind of a geographic DNS resolution in front of it. So if one of our servers goes offline, it just kind of keeps sending stuff to another server that we had, which was in Asia. But so it kind of sucked for everybody, but we could keep running if this thing went really bad for us. But anyways, we put this thing into production and started trying to figure out what was happening. And it actually turned out that there were 2 bugs going on. The biggest, most noticeable was S3 just, on that day that you saw on that timeline, it just went 4x slower. Its REST API just went to crap. And what's really crazy to me, I still can't wrap my mind around this, but I mean, Ben and I sat there and we looked at it. From the data center in Austin, we could access S3 over APIs faster than we could within Amazon's own network. So it was just kind of this insane thing. So to deal with S3, we just had to invent the cache that I've been trying to avoid all along. And once we put that cache in, that solved our page load times. But we still had the SSL issue, which we finally hunted down on. We found like a 3-year-old bug on Launchpad that a bunch of different people within Canonical had hit this, like hosting their own web servers. And essentially, the Apache has different ways to handle connections, and kind of the default one is a threaded model. And apparently the way, I don't know if it's probably more Apache than libSSL, but apparently they're not doing something in a totally thread-safe way, and every once in a blue moon, you would get some memory corruption, and you would get this kind of SSL handshake failure. So we literally just changed the Apache connection handling thing to this NPM prefork, which has multiple processes for a process per connection. And for a site like ours, it costs more memory, but releases isn't, Google.com, so it wasn't prohibitive. And once we did that, like all of our problems went away. So that really solved everything for us at that point. And we've been running releases on ARM hardware ever since then. We've had no issues. The only downtime we've had, our co-location facility had a HVAC failure, and it knocked out like 3 rows of servers one day, and we were affected by that. But releases itself, it has run without any problems. And I threw a picture of John on this because I had, in the early days of UEFI on ARM, I used to curse him very frequently because it wasn't working well, and I liked U-boot, and I knew how to deal with that. But when you have a big data center, like I'm starting to get in Austin, you've got multiple servers from multiple vendors, you need them to be like cattle and not like pets. And UEFI and standards actually made that a lot easier for us to just deal with servers. So with that, that's kind of the point. I wanted to make this kind of interactive at this point and get some opinions from people. Releases is one of our most heavily used sites, and it works good. But we want to run more stuff on ARM. We think it's important to dog food stuff. And I kind of have 2 constraints on it as far as services I would want to do. I'm up for hosting something that's essentially horizontally scalable and stateless, like what releases is, to where we can just put it in, and if it's not doing good, no one notices except for us, and we can analyze the failure and move on. Or the other one is just something that, if it's up 95% of the time, no one cares about the other 5%. So just throwing out 2 examples of services that might be able to do that is patches.linaro.org is a service that gets used quite a bit, but it's not mission critical. But it does use Postgres pretty heavily, so you get some kind of cool database usage on ARM. And we also use Git pretty heavily on that. So it'd be kind of an interesting service. And then if we want to really go for the gold, we could put a new Git mirror in the lab there. And since it's done kind of by geographic DNS, you know, we have another one in our main Git servers in Virginia, I guess. Yeah. So kind of on the, so, you know, most of the Southwest United States would go through the lab. The one big thing that would stress this, I was thinking about recently, is all the ARM builders that we have are in that Colo also. So a lot of our CI loop would wind up going through the server, which there's good and bad to that, right? So I don't know if you guys want to, like, if there's ever, I mean, is there any service like you think we could move to ARM, Riku, that?
Well, if you ask me, we should do all of them. We should just make a specific order of them, like start from the least relevant ones and then go down towards whatever is the most important to the organization. But are you like considering only the servers that the systems is managing, or because aren't some of the services managed by IT?
Yeah, it's easier for us to deal with the systems ones just because we're systems. But I mean, like repo.linaro.org. Yeah, I mean, we could do that pretty easy. You want to actually write that one down, Ben? That one might be a little more difficult.
Yeah, that one would be quite difficult. List salaries go. Was it there's debate on getting Melon free or so yeah.
Well, and just reliability. I mean, if that goes down, that's going to make people angry.
One thing is that if the services are fully deployed with Ansible, then technically you can just deploy it on the aarch64 server. If there's any issue, you just deploy it on x86 server and forget about it. But this doesn't work if there is some data that needs to be migrated from one to the other.
That's usually what makes this hard for everything.
For example, the REPL Linaro is still not Ansible-ized, so that's the first step to do, which we should have done already like a year ago.
I have a private branch that kind of does it. The problem with repo.linaro.org, that's that, I forget the Debian, it runs that kind of packages project, and that's not very Ansible friendly. You make change to a comp file, and you have to kind of run a command, and then it like applies changes to. It's hard to config manage the way that thing works. It can be done, but I mean, it's one we can move over. But like you said, you have to remember to copy all the data over.
In case the REPL Linaro is not that complicated, because the data is the Debian packages that come to the incoming queue. We just need to check what has come in before the last interruption and re-upload them.
Yeah. Now, if that is repo used for the CI loop pretty heavily right now?
It is, but it's also, I think, very safe to deploy. There's no complicated aarch64 going on.
Okay. Yeah, that's not a bad idea. And what's funny about this is, I mean, like, right now releases is running on this one server, but I've got it constrained to like 2 CPUs and 2 gigs of RAM, and the server itself, I think, has, 16 gigs. Like it's still basically a completely idle server, so we can throw a few more containers on there. And so after repo, what would you want to see?
I don't remember all the services we have out of box, so
So we got releases on S3 first. We now have the 96 board server completely on S3, so we can actually move it to this server now. Ben finished it like the week before Connect, and we were a little bit afraid to try to make that change last week, but we can move that one over. And
The one thing that I wouldn't move would be Jenkins.
yeah, it barely works on on Intel. So. Yeah, I agree.
So a question, when do you expect to see the LAS16 books actually be removed from everything?
So it's a good question. It's a little bit complicated because I've talked to management before, and one thing that Amazon does have very good characteristics for a company. You're not having to manage your own hardware and things like that. And I think management is somewhat reluctant to just completely move away from Amazon. We don't want it to. I'm the only guy in Austin that deals with this, and I mean personally, I don't want my entire job to just become, dealing with, replacing old servers, and it gets costly. And the Colo is actually, it's expensive. I think long run, I believe it's cheaper than Amazon. Yeah, this is just kind of my own little personal objective tangent here, but I think so I've been doing a lot of work on the Linaro developer cloud as well, and part of why I'm interested in that is that I think there's this kind of interesting place now with ARM. You have so much compute density and energy efficiency, which is also a major cost to the Colo. So this is just kind of a funny side story to my other, I'm on 2 tangents now, but when we first wired up, we've got 3 racks of servers in our data center. When we first wired them all up, they actually called us one day and were like, hey, is everything running okay? I'm like, yeah, what's the problem? They're like, well, your energy usage, y'all just don't draw many amps. We thought maybe there was like some power problem. And I'm like, no, everything's up and running. It's just, it's ARM hardware. It doesn't use much. So I think that Amazon's really expensive. I feel like they employ psychologists for their pricing model, because you get really pissed off at them and you're like, screw that, we're going to do it ourselves. And then you start looking around at other options. You're like, oh, well, that is kind of expensive. But, if you could get like a really nice setup with OpenStack and ARM hardware, I feel like you could just get a rack of servers, in some nice data facility. And I think you could make a pretty good pitch that it's cheaper than Amazon, it's more performant, and I think you could just make a better business model that way. I think that's a good, I don't know if that's like Linaro's strategic direction or anything, but to me, I think it makes sense for hosting stuff. But that said, again, there's some nervousness about just getting too much into us putting everything on ARM hardware and having to manage that and pay for it ourselves. Yeah, and like with hardware changes and upgrades and stuff like that, one of the things I spent a lot of time with the developer cloud is I've kind of recently gotten really interested into being able to do live migration of VMs and containers, because one problem I have in the Colo is I'll need to upgrade a kernel on a host or something, and I'll have like 5 tenants on it, and I have to, go email them and say, hey, is it okay if I bring your server down, over the weekend, and then bring everything back up for you? It's just kind of a pain to deal with the maintenance of that. But when you start having things like live migration of services, there's still the financial cost to doing, hardware upgrades and stuff, but you can start just moving people around in services without anyone noticing. And that stuff works right now in ARM. It actually works well. It got cut out of the demo this morning, but when you fire up a VM in our developer cloud, you can like log into it and have some interactive session going on, and I can migrate you to another server, and you won't detect it from the command line. So you just say move everything.
The first step is to just make a list of all the services we have, and then we can rank them order and stuff.
Yeah. Talking to some of the sales I think we'll have is when we have a single point of failure, and you have a service require a master. Yeah, and that goes down as long as it's sort of practically fits up quite quickly. Yeah, careful with that.
On the other hand, most of the stuff we do is not that critical. I mean, it's one day or 1 weekend that gets fixed.
Which,
The stuff that is critical communication channels, we don't do that on our servers anyways.
yeah, and I mean, that's partly how we're kind of in this mess in the first place. Is like creating highly available services is expensive. I mean, like from an engineering standpoint, it's hard to do, and a lot of times it's just like the original releases server was just not built that way. It just used a local file system, and hey, it was easy enough, and it's up 99% of the time. But at some point, you've got to move past it. And it's hard, but it's not always worth it, like you said. So it's down a little bit. Is 95% uptime better than $50,000 in engineering time to make it highly available?
So they're essentially bandwidth limited on that Colo.
What's
Bandwidth limits on Colo.
I mean, they charge if we exceed some threshold, but it's a pretty high threshold. And I don't think that would be too big of, I mean, if you think about it, a lot of the things we're talking about would wind up, most of the traffic would be in, like say we put a new Git server in there, most of the traffic would just be internal within a switch, so it might not even, maybe jump one switch, but it's just like, between our racks. So, I mean, in some ways that would be good for the CI loops, right? Because you're going to be Git cloning at gigabit network speed instead of.
Same for APT get and do the slice directly from the same network.
So I mean, in that case, we'd use less bandwidth, I guess.
Did you notice any architecture problems when you were doing some releases?
You mean like architecture-specific things, like in our deployment? No, I mean, it just all.
I don't think we should have any of those at this point. What we might find some interesting hardware bugs because of all our hardware that Colo is completely like production stuff.
The hardware we're on is actually production stuff. We're actually very little hardware in the Colo is like Rev A type stuff. I know in Cambridge we've got like in the Lava validation lab, they get a lot of just early stuff. It's just the nature of how that works. But most of the stuff I've gotten is like real stuff. I mean, I was nervous, just like when we were looking at that bug with releases, with this, we suspect there's something in Apache and maybe memory corruption. I was a little bit worried, well, if we do this on ARM, are we just not going to see it for some, because I mean, this bug was happening like once a week or something for, a couple of hundred CI jobs. I mean, it was probably happening 1 in 1,000 times people were accessing.
We reduce it.
around it, yeah.
You run into it every year, acceptance, so.
Speaking of compassion, we have this evolution for the Linaro or people Linaro or doing the LAS16-103 bunch of static websites.
Yeah.
So Ben and I have talked, those are a little more complex for other reasons, but
Well, the same problem is even like an application like WordPress, which is,
PHP.
you'd assume it would be quite easy to be high variable considering, it's development. But it's actually a really bad size to get into high availability from the point of view. WordPress is just, yes, PHP is awful. And it's also dependent on local files. I think uploading to the blog, you need some sort of place to store those local files, and the whole architecture of WordPress doesn't really support around.
But on the other hand, if the website goes down, it's nobody's progress going to stop. So there's time to figure out what it's about.
it is a little bit embarrassing for the front page of Linaro to just go offline.
It doesn't respond when you go to
Static website point there for a year.
where it is calculated. But I think any service that goes down, I mean, it's just, yeah, it's not mission critical. I think any service is really, but it's just embarrassing to have a service go
Yeah.
down, especially when it goes down for, I think, if you have longer than 4 hours of taking publicity, you've got a service down for 4 hours. I think that's sort of time where you should be putting care out, oh my god, we need to back up pretty soon.
I do think eventually we've got to move, to me, we've got to move Linaro.org onto ARM hardware. It just seems like the right thing to do. But that one is, I mean, Ben and I have talked about that one because I feel like that just needs to be done, you know.
So if there's some plan to make it a little bit more formal, like Ben and I have talked about it.
Not really. I mean, I talk about it some to my boss, but I think something we need to make something a little more formal. But I think Ben and I need to sort out. I'm not sure we know everything that needs to be done right now, and
Well, I think if we're going to go to that level where with management, then we need sort of an AWS style management console where you can have, you basically become your own hosting.
well,
We have
and
a DevCloud, so basically what we would need is a DevCloud-esque way of dealing with your instances and your services, and using the DevCloud in a way that, say, if it does develop the underlying hardware, it can automatically migrate to some good hardware in the same data systems, which is the whole main requirement of the first place.
yeah.
And then you would have a pretty redundant service once the root doesn't work. And that will allow people who don't have access to the data center or to the command line to have a UI and stuff like that. So if we're going to go to the level of things like Linaro and other services like that, we would need to also put another front end on top of it where, I guess,
Yeah, and
log in, actually deal with everything.
actually there's some loose ends we still need to tie up with, like releases. So at the time when I was doing that, we have an OpenStack deployment in Austin, but it's the first one we had done, which we have tenants on. I mean, there's actually probably almost 100 people using it right now, but we're not actually it's more of a glorified way to run VMs. It's not really using OpenStack how we set it up, and the next version of it, we also deployed it in a way we can't upgrade our way out of it, essentially. So I'm in the developer cloud V2 I'm going to be deploying in Austin in the upcoming month will just be completely new hardware, and eventually we'll have to move tenants over kind of one by one to this new model. But because of all this, when I set up the releases server, I just took a bare metal server in the lab and used containers and said, well, here's how I'm going to do it. And
To go forward, we're probably should look into getting releases on
into the developer cloud.
the developer code, and then moving other
Yeah.
We probably should get the architecture of the ARM front end to the point where this is good, we're happy with the controllability of it, and then we can be at the point where we start to really have ourselves onto it.
And I guess we should talk some, like, if we move into OpenStack, the way we've got it set up now, you're running VMs, which is fine, but I just feel like for like the services we're doing, we could get a lot more, basically compute density. We can run a lot of stuff just on one server if we use containers.
Yeah.
We could run all the Linaro publishing servers on one thing, repoed all. We could basically put about 6 different services on one ARM host, and it would probably still be mostly idle. Whereas if we do 6 VMs, it's going to start to. But I haven't sorted out how to do it. You can do containers in OpenStack, but it's just not something I've looked into, and I don't think that's really a.
Services are mostly IDH, it doesn't matter if it's a container or VM.
Well, yeah. I mean, there is more. So OpenStack with VMs, you can overcommit on CPUs. You can't overcommit on total RAM, right? You can't. So if you've got 16 gigs of RAM and you run. No. So I mean, and it's fine. You could still run a lot of VMs on a host. It's just you don't get quite as much compute density as